following is a special presentation of KTIB's 50th anniversary, celebrating our broadcast history, proudly serving the people of Houma-Thibodaux since 1953. One voice heard on 1970s local radio was Dave McNamara. Let's hear this newsman's broadcast memories of the Houma-Thibodaux area. Dave McNamara, how you doing today?
I'm doing just fine. Thanks for calling.
Well, let's start from the beginning. Where are you originally from?
Well, I grew up in the Houma area. In fact, not too far from where the mall is, back in Broadmoor subdivision.
All righty. Now, was getting involved in broadcasting always a dream of yours growing up?
Actually, I was interested in electronics and wanted to be an electrical engineer or electronics engineer. And I was in high school at Terrebonne High, and it was the year that they started Junior Achievement. And one of the Junior Achievement clubs or companies that they started was a radio company, and that was sponsored by KHOM in Houma. And I got into it because I wanted to learn about electronics. And we put together a half-hour Saturday morning school radio program that we sold advertisements for. We did school news and sports. And I just ended up getting my, back then you needed to have an FCC license to work at a radio station, to be a disc jockey or an announcer. And I happened to get my FCC license, and then that turned into a part-time job at KHOM, and then eventually that became full-time work, and then I'd gone off to school and came back and got interested in covering news. At KHOM in Houma from about 1972 through the end of 1979, and that's when I moved to New Orleans.
What was your college major?
A bunch of different things. Started off in music, then went to broadcasting, then took a lot of business courses.
Did you go straight into news? Was that your first job there?
No, I started spinning records, and back then KHOM had a real interesting format. It was, a station was run by Ray Sadie, and it played, at that time, a format that was called MOR, which was middle-of-the-road music, which was everything from Frank Sinatra to the Carpenters, you know, soft, easy music. And at nighttime, we did these 1 to 2 hour programming blocks where we had, during the dinner hour, there was, there was dinner music, there was big band music, swing shift that was on for a couple of hours, I think between 7 and 9, and then there was a classical hour where we played light classics, and then there was beautiful music from 10 o'clock until midnight, and then we signed off the air. But my first work there was part-time, and it involved working some of these shifts at night, and, you know, playing music, and then playing music during the day. And KHOM always, and as well as KTIB, both stations always had a real heavy commitment to covering local news. And if there was some big issue in town, whether it was something like teachers threatening to go out on strike or election coverage, we would always cover it live. Mm-hmm. And my introduction to news began, there was one person who worked at KTIB, Marie Bergeron, and then one person who worked at KHOM, Anna Slade. And then she got married, had children, and didn't want to be covering news 20 hours a day, and so I started covering school board meetings, city council meetings, and police jury meetings, because those public bodies in Terrebonne always met at night. And that was my introduction to news, sitting in on Terrebonne Parish School Board meetings, going to the station, writing up stories on what happened, and then it kind of grew from there.
Okay, now, speaking to a lot of people about Mr. Sadie, he was a very hands-on owner, and of course he was a manager at KTIB before starting up KHOM. Did he often tell you or give you a lot of advice during your years there?
Oh, sure. You certainly knew when you did something he didn't like. We had a hotline in the studio that would ring, and you'd hear the voice of Ray Sadie letting you know, "Sweetheart, what was that you just did?" And so, he was very hands-on. And the same thing with news stories. I can recall him calling me one night after I read a story on our 10 o'clock news at night on KHOM, and it was a story about a police jury meeting where there was an adoption of some resolution on a motion by so-and-so, and it was a bunch of legalese mumbo-jumbo is what I wrote, and Ray called up and said, "Sweetheart, so what did they do?" I said, "Well, what they did was they decided to put a tax on the ballot to, do whatever." He goes, "Well, why didn't you just say that in the news story?" I'm like, "Oh, okay, I get it." So he was very hands-on. He was a good teacher. He was a great boss to work for.
Well, let's talk about another gentleman who worked there, who wore many hats as well, and people will know him, a very knowledgeable man about music as well as news, Roy McNamara.
That's right. Roy was the program director and the morning show host. Really, the entire time that I worked there, in the early to mid to late 70s. Great guy. Spent his entire career working in radio, and Roy's job was to, Roy had to walk a fine line between trying to play music that pushed it in a direction he wanted to go, and yet, keep it in line with Ray Sadie's tastes. And, he fought those battles, and as well as did the morning show. And in fact, during my later years at KHOM, used to be the announcers played music and read the news on the top of the hour. But we began to do more of a morning program where I would come in and do the news on the morning show with Roy. And then we also had the half-hour public affairs program, similar to what Marie did at KTIB, the dialogue show, which she did for, my gosh, how many years. We did a similar program at KHOM during the midday. It was called Radio Roundtable, where we would have guests in discussing community issues, that sort of thing. And so that was my responsibility, along with all the newscasts during the day.
Okay, at the time you're at KHOM, did you also work there with Ken Berthelot?
Yeah, Ken was a sports guy. He did some regular newscasts as well as all of the play-by-play. The station at that time covered the local sports scene. We covered we had football games, and Ken went on to great things. He left KHOM and went, I believe, up to Alexandria. Got into television. Spent a long period of time there, and then came back to the New Orleans area. Was the voice of the Tulane Green Wave.
There's another gentleman that I believe worked at KHOM when you were there, a pretty established gentleman as well, Rick Luquette.
Yes. Yeah, Rick, in fact, was doing I'm trying to remember, the afternoons and the evenings. Yeah, Rick was there for a long time.
So your career at KHOM lasts 7 years, and obviously you learned a lot from all the people you worked with. Where did you go on from there?
Well, decided to try to get a job in New Orleans. Oh, somebody else who worked there. In fact, I was doing the news on the Houma side of things, and she was doing the news along with Marie and Thibodeau, and that was Margaret Dubazon. And of course, Margaret, did news at KTIB for a number of years, and then moved to New Orleans, where she did, I believe it was WGSO, which was an all-news radio station in New Orleans. And after doing that for a few years, auditioned for television, and then ended up being the main anchor on Channel 8 for a number of years.
Okay. Also at KHOM, before I forget, did you also work with Dave Burris?
Oh, sure. Yeah, great guy. Dave was there most of the time that I was there. Well, he loved the oldies and was able to do a Saturday night oldies show, which he carried on for a number of years.
Did you go to New Orleans straight from there?
Went from KHOM to WSMB in New Orleans doing news. They were trying to go to an all-news format. And that was back when Keith Rush was doing the midday program on WSMB, where he had been for years. Nutt and Jeff were doing the morning show, and my job was to go in and do a solid hour of news from 5 until 6 a.m. And then Nutt and Jeff came on from 6 till 10. I did news during their program, and then news once Keith came on through the noon hour. That was an experience. That was they were up on the 13th floor of the Maison Blanche building. It was kind of a odd place to go to work at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's when I went in and began getting the news together for the day. And probably one of the few elevators in the city that actually had an operator. You'd hit the elevator, and there was an elevator operator who would drive the elevator up to the 13th floor.
Wow. By the way, since you were at WSMB, did you also know Larry Regan?
Yes, Larry was doing the overnights there for a time when I was there. Stayed at WSMB for probably a little less than a year, and then Todd Bauer, who was an alumni of KTIB and KHOM, had been doing news at WNOE, and I think Todd pitched my name over there, and they gave me a call, and then I did news on both WNOE AM and FM for a couple of years, and then eventually followed Todd over to WWL Radio, and that was in about 1982, and did the afternoon news. We were doing an all-news afternoon drive format, and a number of co-hosts during that stint, as well as Hap Glaude. That's when Hap was doing his afternoon show on radio, his final years in broadcasting there.
Did you also happen to know Ed Clancy?
Oh, sure. Ed was at WGSO when I went to New Orleans, and that's when Ed was doing his great radio cartoons, the late 70s and early 80s. And then Ed came over and was doing our middays on WWL radio for several years. Talented guy, very talented guy.
And then, of course, I believe it was from 870 AM that you went over to Channel 4, correct?
Yeah, it was just, just like radio, which I never intended to go into, but once I got into it, I really enjoyed. TV was just one of those things that, maybe someday I'll try to do it. And the folks at Channel 4 were receptive to me trying to learn how to do TV. And what I did, I would work radio Monday through Friday, and then on the weekends, I would go into the TV station and hang out with one of the reporters. And at that time, John Snell was the weekend anchor on Channel 4, and he took me under his wing, and he would go out to do a story. I would tag along, and he'd do an interview and say, Dave, is there anything you'd like to ask so-and-so? And if there was, I'd ask a few questions, and then we'd both go back to the station, and he would do the real story, and then I would just do a practice story. Then I would get it critiqued by the news director, and that went on for a period of, probably 4 to 6 months. And then, they decided to take a chance on me, and I began working part-time on weekends on Channel 4, doing real stories. And then eventually there was a full-time opening. I got hired for that, and that was back in 1990. So, it's 13 years ago, and I've been doing TV ever since, and it's just a great place to work and do TV, and I've loved it.
Were there any stories that you covered in our area that seemed to stand out?
I think that KHOM and KTIB were what local radio was all about. That was back at a time where you were required to do news and public affairs, and the stations took that commitment very seriously, went above and beyond what was required, made a huge commitment to local news and local programming. So it was really a great place to learn. And, from a news standpoint, just the variety of stories that we were able to cover. That was back during Edwin Edwards' early years. That was back when Hunt Downer was first elected to the state legislature. Claude Duval was the Senate president. Leonard Chabert was a longtime state legislator from the area. You had just, big political names. Royal Pellegrin was on the police jury. There were just so many stories. Hurricanes, which threatened the area back in the 70s. The station would broadcast round the clock. We'd do live remotes down from the civil defense, as it was called at that time. I can recall, the major elections of those days, where we would sit down at the clerk of court's office, and you talk about 30 years ago, Bobby Boudreaux was a clerk of court then, and he's still the clerk of court today. In fact, I saw him today down at the courthouse in Houma. But I can recall covering a an election one Saturday night. It was one of the big fall elections where everybody was elected from police juror to governor. And it was at a time when we actually changed, I guess we would have changed from daylight savings time back to regular time. And the clock changed during our coverage at 2 o'clock in the morning. That's how late and how extensive the election returns were back then. You know, there was the big gas explosion down on Main Street in Houma, down near one of the jewelry stores. That would be, I guess, at Main and Church Street, near the courthouse. That was back in the early 70s, I believe. I heard on the scanner one day a robbery at a little supermarket in downtown Houma, and I went racing out there in my car with a live transmitter in the back of the car. I was talking to the station while I was driving out there, and we were in that S-curve on Hollywood Road, on the Hollywood Road extension, and the robbers were coming toward me and actually ran me off the road, and the police were in hot pursuit, firing shots out the window. And they tracked them down on the couplet, as it was called, then on Park Avenue, and just filled the car with gunfire. And miraculously, nobody was killed. But Homa's had its share of big stories. That's the old Bayou de Large Bridge. They called it the Green Monster, and it was repeatedly being rammed by everything from barges to seaplanes. And then they eventually replaced that with what was then the new Bayou de Large Bridge. The Main Street Bridge repeatedly being knocked out of service by some of the barge traffic on the Intracoastal Canal. And of course, gill nets and shrimping, that was always big news there as well.
Right. Well, I tell you what, it sounds like pretty exciting memories you had here, and it's good to know that, especially every Mardi Gras, we see you covering some of the Houma parades.
I always put in a request for that. It's the thing that you don't realize until you leave and you come back is just how genuinely friendly the people are in Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes. And, it was a great place to grow up. Those were absolutely great stations to work at, just to learn the business, to learn news, because they just took it all so seriously. I mean, they really were a part of the community and really had a commitment to covering news, and that's just something that's stuck with me for all these long 30 years.
Wow. Well, listen, Dave McNamara, we really appreciate your time. Before we go, is there anything you'd like to say to our listeners?
Hey, just thanks for listening way back when, and thanks for supporting those local stations, and it was great.
Dave McNamara, another shining example of a successful career that started in our area.